All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Docuvera, NNIT, and our speakers, thanks for joining us for our presentation on content governance in the age of AI, preparing pharma organizations for EPI and FHIR. I'm Donna Fritz, CMO of Docuvera. Let's quickly walk through what our speakers will cover today. Content governance, AI, EPI, and FHIR are all important topics. So to make things easier, we've grouped today's talk into 5 sections designed to provide you important background, what's happening in the industry, and practical ways you can move forward regardless of where you are in your own process. As a reminder, all attendees will be on mute. The webinar is being recorded and an on-demand version will be available to attendees within the next few days. If you have questions, please use the question button at the bottom right, and you can submit your queries at any time during the presentation, and the speakers will address them at the end. So let's get started. First, about our host companies. Docuvera is the only governance-first structured content platform purpose-built for the pharma industry. With Docuvera, organizations eliminate manual rework, ensure regulatory-grade quality, and unlock over 80% reuse of content, accelerating submissions and time to market. NNIT is a leading provider of IT solutions to life sciences internationally and to the public and private sectors in Denmark. They focus on high complexity industries and thrive in environments where regulatory demands and complexity are high. They advise on and build sustainable digital solutions that work for the patients, citizens, employees, end users, and customers. And now more about today's presenters. Murali Menon, Chief Revenue Officer at Docuvera, leads go-to-market strategy, business development, and customer partnerships for life sciences organizations modernizing regulated content. With more than 20 years in technology and digital transformation, Murali helps pharmaceutical companies transition from document-centric processes to data-driven component-based workflows that improve governance, compliance, and speed to market. Emily Trollberg-Hansen, Regulatory Affairs Consultant at NNIT, specializes in FHIR-based regulatory data systems for global pharma. She works as a business SME, helping customers implement pipelines that replace document-centric workflows with structured, interoperable data flows across systems. Alexandra Ansack, Regulatory Affairs and Clinical Expert at NNIT, specializes in the transition from document-based to data-centric regulatory operations. With experience across both large pharma and emerging biotech organizations, she advises on regulatory strategy, structured content, and cross-functional data integration. And with that, I will hand it off to Alex.
Thank you for the introduction, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start the presentation with a simple observation. For decades, regulatory affairs has been a document-driven function. Success was measured by the ability to author, review, approve, and submit documents. The document was the primary regulatory asset. What is changing today is not the importance of the document itself. What is changing is what sits behind those documents. Increasingly, regulators are expecting information to exist as structured, reusable, machine-readable content that can move across systems, organizations, and regulatory processes. In other words, we are moving from the world where data is embedded inside documents to a world where documents are increasingly assembled from governed data and content. This shift is not theoretical. It's already visible across multiple regulatory initiatives globally. When we look at the current regulatory initiatives, it's easy to see them as separate programs. One team is focused on EPI, another is working on IDMP compliance, clinical groups are following ICH M11, CMC is evaluating PQ-CMC. And across Europe, we are seeing movement towards electronic product information and digital product lifecycle management. But if we step back, there is a common pattern. All of these initiatives require information that is structured. They require standardized definitions, traceability, reusability, and they increasingly require machine readability. So while these initiatives may appear different on the surface, they are all pushing the industry toward the same destination, a more data-centric and content-centric operating model. Let's briefly look at what these initiatives are signaling. With EPI, regulators are moving towards structured medicinal product information that can be exchanged and consumed digitally. With IDMP and SPOR, the focus is on standardized product, organization, substance, and referential data. ICH M11 introduces structured protocol information to improve consistency and reuse throughout the clinical development lifecycle. PQ-CMC reflects a broader move towards structured quality and manufacturing information. And initiatives around electronic product lifecycle management continue to reinforce digital information exchange. Now, each of these initiatives has its own objectives, timelines, and implementation consideration. But from an operating model perspective, they all point in the same direction. They all assume that information is governed, structured, reusable, and traceable. That is the larger transformation we need to focus on. Unfortunately, this future state often looks very different from today's reality. Most pharmaceutical organizations have invested heavily in systems such as clinical, safety, manufacturing, quality, or regulatory systems. But these systems were typically designed to optimize individual functions. They were not designed to create reusable regulatory content across the enterprise. As a result, we still see significant manual effort. Information is extracted from one system, transformed in spreadsheets, copied into documents, reviewed multiple times, and then recreated elsewhere. At the same time, submission volume continues to increase. Global variation become more complex. Product information must be updated more frequently, and timelines continue to compress. So the challenge facing organizations today is not a lack of information. Most of organizations have more information than ever before. The challenge is turning that information into trusted, reusable regulatory content. Another important trend is the increasing importance of traceability. Historically, traceability was often achieved through process, documentation, and human oversight. Today's expectations are changing. Organizations are expected to answer questions such as, where did this information originate? What source supports it? Which products use it? Which submissions contain it? What changed, when, and why? And importantly, can that information be demonstrated consistently? As content becomes more structured and more reusable, traceability can no longer be treated as a separate activity. It needs to be implemented into the way information is managed. In many ways, traceability is becoming an architectural requirement that that's simply a procedural requirement. This leads to perhaps the most important point of my presentation. Regulatory submissions may be owned by regulatory affairs, but the information inside those submissions come from across the enterprise. Clinical data originates in development systems, safety information originates in pharmacovigilance processes, CMC information originates in manufacturing and quality environments. Product information may come from multiple operational systems. In summary, regulatory output is increasingly dependent on enterprise data. And that means regulatory readiness is no longer just a regulatory affairs challenge. It is a cross-functional challenge involving data quality, governance, interoperability, and content management across the organization. I do think the direction of travel is quite clear. Regulators are increasingly expecting structured, reusable, machine-readable information. Organizations are generating more data than ever before, and regulatory outcomes are becoming increasingly dependent on the quality and governance of the enterprise information. The question is no longer whether the industry is moving in this direction. The question is, how do we connect data across systems? How do we enable interoperability? And what role do standards such as FHIR play in making that possible? To explore that, I will hand over to Emilia.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I dive into the answer of that, I would like to highlight and deep dive a bit into the transition happening in the area of EPI. Because EU has confirmed a transition that will require pharma companies to submit marketing applications and product labeling in a structured digital format using FHIR. So this is not a guidance or a recommendation, but an actual FHIR mandate that will also set a huge precedent for what other regulators will do in the future. Today, we are already in the transition period, with 28 being the year where EPI becomes mandatory for all newly authorized medicines. So why is this a big deal today? Because product information that EPI submission depends on doesn't live in just one system. In most pharma companies, it needs to be assembled by hand from multiple disconnected systems. So I believe most of you will recognize this illustration. In broad terms, we have all the internal systems to the left. And typically we would have multiple source systems and each storing valuable data, but they are operating in silos. A lot of attributes live scattered, unstructured, and fragmented across these systems, and the reason is fair. Each system was bought to solve its own problem and not to feed submissions or to communicate across. So to gain the insights from the individual systems and to provide information to either decision makers or regulators, the manual work upstream is the same. And typically the aggregation happens manually and is managed by the human in the middle. We would have different teams exporting their pieces of information in different formats. Could be in XML format, in CSV, or in spreadsheets. And then someone in the regulatory affairs team has to gather it, reconcile it, and translate this information into the format that the regulators expect. Then they would review the results, and this process would have to be repeated for every regulator. And the consequences of fragmentation is inconsistent terminologies between systems, loss of traceability in the assembly process, and a heavy reliance on manual reconciliation. And this would typically lead to overhead, rework, delays, or increased risk of compliance issues. So we see that the gap between what the regulators expect and what the company's current very fragmented infrastructure can deliver is increasing. And to solve this challenge and close the gap, we need to achieve interoperability across systems, and this is where FHIR comes into the picture. Our solution to this is to implement a FHIR canonical layer that acts as your semantic contract between systems. So instead of the manual layer in the middle, we would use FHIR to normalize terminologies and route data between systems without manual intervention. This layer would act as a shared agreement on what each data field means, how it's structured, and how it relates to other data. And to explain FHIR briefly, it was originally born in healthcare because hospitals and clinics needed a way to share patient data information across their different systems. And that is exactly the same problem that FHIR can solve today in the life science, as we need multiple different systems to communicate together easily, and FHIR allows that. So by using FHIR, it means that your internal systems, they can keep working exactly as they do today, and you can keep all your local term values also as is. FHIR do the translation and the semantic alignment, then that enables data to flow between your systems from your internal systems to a structured content authoring system like Docuvera or directly to regulators. One example where FHIR will reconcile different local representations of the same concept across systems could be dose form. Imagine that you have dose form represented in 3 different systems. In the first system, it could be represented as a tablet. In the other, it could be tab. And in the third system, it could be represented as an internal code. And typically, we would see this semantic issue being solved manually by normalizing the data or building a data lake. But FHIR would align the meaning without having to change the local term values in your systems. Instead, the meaning will be aligned automatically at the point of exchange. So by using the interoperable FHIR data standard, we can build the APIs that connects systems with each other. The APIs will move data into and out of the canonical layer that we have in the middle. Source data will flow in, get normalized against the semantic contract, and in this example, the API requirements, the API implementation guide, and then become available to flow freely to any downstream destination like Docuvera in a structured and validated form. And validation is another important piece that this setup enables, because before the data reaches Docuvera, it passes through a validation layer. For API specifically, this is where we check conformance against the API requirements. In this case, it would be type 2. And it means that errors are found much faster instead of much later in the process and by the regulator. So it means that by the time that data lands in Docuvera for structured content authoring, it's already been validated against the standard. So what does this actually mean for you? There are, of course, multiple benefits of FHIR. I could keep going on, but I will focus on 3 concrete ones. First, FHIR means increased patient safety and reduced product recalls. When labeling updates become electronic rather than paper-based today, the most current information reaches patient in real time and immediately rather than weeks later. And this also results in a reduced number of physical recalls for the labeling content as updates will be managed centrally. Secondly, FHIR means reduced compliance risk. And that is because that every output is validated against the API standard, as mentioned before it leaves your environment with full traceability back to the source. Instead of errors and queries being sent back from the regulator, EMA, FDA, or others, the findings are caught much faster, reducing the risk of delayed launches, and also it will free up resources from remediation and rework. And finally, FHIR means multiplied capacity, because FHIR enables a model where data can be maintained and reused instead of manually rebuilding every variation, market, and label changes from scratch. And when this happens, this is where the investment will pay back. Today, the focus has been very much around API, but before I hand over to or back to Docuvera, I would like to show some examples of the breadth of what FHIR also enables, because API is just one use case of FHIR. The underlying architecture with the canonical layer, the semantic contract, and the resource model would be the same regardless of what you are submitting and to who. What would change is the FHIR implementation guides, the vocabularies, and the concept mapping and the use cases. And that is also why we typically frame FHIR as an enterprise capability and not just a regulatory project. So first, we have built a PMS enrichment tool that uses FHIR to automatically upload or enrich validated attributes from RIMS into EMA PMS. Secondly, we have built a data comparison tool that automatically compares data from different source systems to ensure that data is always aligned and correct. And one example of also a real-time data exchange project is where we use FHIR to remove the manual work of sharing information between RIMS and ERP. And it meant that the ERP team would actually avoid to ship products that was already taken off the market, and therefore the company didn't have to destroy as many shipments as before. The last example, we also used FHIR, of course, to automate the assembly of the Module 3 content. Instead of manually aggregating data from 4 different systems, we automated that workflow so the data was flowing freely or directly into the documents and actually within minutes. And now back to the specific API use case, I will hand back to Docuvera, where structured content authoring is the focus. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Alex and Emily. I think thanks for that wonderful introduction and the background of what we're going to talk about. So essentially what you've heard is where regulations are heading from an API and FHIR perspective. And I want to really pick up from where Alex and Emily left off. Because what I want to talk about is how do you really actually govern that content, which basically is what gets presented with regulators. So think of everything that Emily and Alex described as like the destination. But what I want to talk about is like how do you kind of get there, especially in the light of when you think about AI as it moves deeper into the way we create and manage the content. Getting the governance really matters. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'll show you the foundations that are to sit between this API, FHIR, and AI layers. Why today's document-based setup is not necessarily set up for that. And then certainly some practical steps you can take in terms of wherever you are in your journey of this document to data centric transformation process. All right, so let's start with the core problem. I think the usual problems show up as typical 4 frustrations, as I would call it. The first is content silos. I think Alex and Emily mentioned that a little bit, where the same information gets rewritten in a system that really don't talk to each other, and that's why that whole FHIR exchange piece that Emily talked about really comes into picture. Secondly, the change management that's very reactive in organizations. What that means is typically a single update sets off a wave of manual rework downstream. Thirdly, an audit trail situation where you have to reconstruct after the fact, right? Piecing your compliance story together only when an inspector is asking you for that information. And lastly, you have AI initiatives within the organizations that are kind of messy from what we understand. They have untraceable inputs, which means you really cannot trust back what is handed back to you. So these are necessarily not 4 separate problems with 4 separate fixes. They are really just symptoms of one root cause, and that's what the slide starts to talk about. Which is that content is being managed as documents, not as necessarily as governing building blocks. And if you fix that particular root cause, our proposition is that you will actually unlock the potential of your underlying ecosystem. So let's take an example and put some real numbers behind it, right? So assume that you're a large pharma company and picture you have around 200 products sold across 30 markets. multiply that out, and you're looking at least at 6,000 separate data points that you have to stay in sync with one another. Now think about, as Emily talked about, one dosage point, think about layering a single safety update that can take around 200 individual edits. Each and every one of them is a chance for something to slip by, right? And when you add this all up, somewhere between 60 and 70% of the labeling team's capacity gets swallowed in reconciliation rather than doing actual SME work. And you really want these skilled people spending most of their time just not keeping versions updated, but instead doing what they're really hired for, which is real strategic work. So what this means is that the structure underneath really has to change. And before we get to a fix, though, we need to really kind of clear up, some compliance myths that typically that I hear from our customers. So what it means is, we talk about FHIR messages, but people assume that if a FHIR file passes through the validator, they are compliant. And it's not that simple, right? Passing the validator only proves that the file is built correctly. The structure is well formed, it follows the implementation guide, all the things that Emily talked about. But that is syntax, it's not grammar. What it means is it doesn't say anything whether the content inside is actually governed and ready to submit. And you can still sail through the validator and fail, but still fail an EMA submission because your content isn't reconciled across markets, right? There's no approval state or audit trail behind it, and your sources of truth are conflicting with each other. So again, the root cause is it is a content governance problem, and essentially that needs to be fixed. And let's look at some of the ways that we can address that. So today, most systems live in the column on the left-hand side, where you're basically managing in the monolithic documents, as we talked about, right? Every market gets its own complete document. Edit gets retyped market by market. There's no shared source of truth, and the audit trail gets rebuilt after the fact, as we discussed. The shift that we are describing moves you from the left to the right, to govern components, and where you're writing a piece of component, or rather a piece of content as a component, as a fragment, with highly valued metadata around it, coming from the FHIR assets that Emily talked about, and a few other things. So what that means is when you approve a change to this particular component, that change flows automatically to everywhere the component is used. So then you are establishing, what that means is you're really establishing a source of truth, and the audit trail is captured at the moment you create something, instead of being reconstructed under pressure later on, right? Which is typically what happens in an audit situation. So it's essentially the same content your teams are producing today, but on a very fundamentally different foundation. And this is what moves everything, what it makes possible to the other things that I'm going to show you in a few slides. So let's look at how it all comes together. One governed source of truth, and you go from left to right. You have one governed source that closes the gap, and it kind of stands on these 4 pillars that control all the way from creation to a FHIR-ready output at the end. The first pillar is that governed content at creation. So compliance is built from the start, with approval states, version history, a full audit trail on every single component. The second is reuse at the component level rather than the document level, right? So a piece of content propagates across products and regions, and you simply stop reauthoring the same thing again and again and again. The third is interoperable by design. I think Emily touched a little bit, and Alex touched a little bit on this, right? Which means that a FHIR export becomes a natural outcome of the content, how it is built, not a special project that you have to staff up for, right? And then lastly, as we talked about, when we talk about AI enablement in the context of structuring and the context of FHIR, because now you have structured governed content living at the foundations at the infrastructure level, as Alex and Emily mentioned earlier, the common thread is that all these standards are converging together for the same requirement, a single source that can serve every one of these regulations that are kind of coming up. All right, so let's talk about a little bit how looks like in a connected picture, because then I wanted to simplify this as easily as possible, because this is really where this all kind of comes together. So essentially, think about in the middle where we have the governed content core, your single source of truth, and where everything's broken down in components that are versioned and audited. Feeding into that core are your inbounds. We call those as inbound contracts that are supplying that information, which can be source data from your repository, safety information, manufacturer information, your reference labels, your precedents, and all the contributions an author and a subject matter has made to it. And flowing out onto the right of this is all your outbound formats, right? The EPI bundles, the ECTD, the IDMP submissions, your typical print PDFs, Word documents, and regional XMLs, what have you. The key idea is that in the line is what is written at the bottom of this particular slide. You author once, and you author once in the core, and that every regulatory format is simply a governed export of that same content, not a separate rebuild every time. So this is the difference between maintaining one thing well and maintaining a dozen copies badly, right? It's what stops the whole system from sprawling as a number of required formats keep on increasing, because as more regions, as more health authorities keep on adopting digitalization and formats, there will be certain variations. So you don't want to be adjusting your core authoring capabilities to this evolving standards. Rather, you're going to have a stable core format and then adapt to the different formats that are coming on the right-hand side. So that's what we're trying to enable with Docuvera as a central piece of your curated, managed experience per se. All right, so moving on, let's also look at how this plays out. And I think this is something that we spoke earlier as well. But I want to kind of double click on the slide a little bit. Obviously, what the slide is showing is that you have a governed source of content that kind of moves very seamlessly across not just a single document type, but across the organization, across the drug development lifecycle. But if we kind of double click on this for a second, let's think about, just as Emily gave an example, let's think about how many times your product name, its strength, and its identifiers get typed into different systems today, right, by different teams, each keeping their own copy. But in this model, that information is entered and approved once, and every function simply just references it, right? And add on top of it the same FHIR composition that came from your pharmacovigilance team, is the same composition in an attributable form, is aligned with your CMC team, is aligned with your labeling team. That composition can then flow very easily into any life cycle state that you require it, versus trying to massage it, transform it, and enhance it in an artificial manner per se. So that's the real benefit of this, is that you author the truth once, and everybody works from that single trusted source of information, versus trying to do this in a siloed manner. So let's talk about some numbers, because this is what we are hearing from our customers as well. And this is kind of a before and after chart, because we talked about the 4 chronic pains at the start of this presentation, and I wanted to kind of tie the chronic pains to the outcomes that you can actually measure, right? So what that means is when content silos are there, and where every market rekeys the same edits, because you're authoring from one single source and reusing the content again and again, this is where typically the teams will see a north of 80% reuse, and that's the first metric. The reactive change management, where updates are always chasing a deadline because approved changes and they propagate on their own, right? And that's the second row that you see here. That basically tells you there is about 40 to 60% speed up in that particular aspect, because you're not doing reactive change management. It's almost automatic. Those updates are available to you. Thirdly, from an audit trail perspective, the reconstructed audit trail becomes, captured at the creation, at every component, right? And you're not chasing your tail after the fact and trying to kind of build a story that might be disconnected, right? So because your audit trail is captured really at the component at a very granular level, those values, those enhancements are 100% traceable, right? They are fully auditable right from the source of the information. And then lastly, we'll talk about this in a little bit in a few more slides, but essentially when you apply these concepts on these structured governance layers on top of, rather put this into an AI infrastructure, AI running on governed infrastructure produces much faster drafts than what you would typically see just throwing unstructured content to an AI engine. So yeah, let's talk about AI, because that's the next topic that we want to talk about, right? So the basic premise is, our assumption and our belief is that AI built on top of a governance infrastructure like Docuvera is what really enhances the value to the organization. So in other words, AI only delivers value when it's working on governed content. And when AI runs on ungoverned content, it's really leaning on stale PDFs and scattered copies, which outputs can't be really tracked to any source, right? Every result needs to be manually checked. There is drift, there is hallucination, and it really carries a real regulatory risk. But when the same AI runs on governed content, it's drawing from versioned and approved components. Every output is traced right back to its source, and your reviewers are confirming work. Rather, they're really confirming work instead of really rebuilding it from scratch, right? So again, going back to that substrate, that infrastructure that is sitting underneath it, it is what really decides the additional efficiencies that you bring on top of writing things in components and reusing per se. Let's take a look at a visual quickly so it becomes a little bit more tangible. At Docuvera, really our design philosophy with AI works through like a very simple, what we call as hierarchy of intelligence. It's a 3-layered cake, if you can think about it that way, where AI will always prefer the safest option first. And that first layer of safest option is the first level of reuse, right? And that's the bottom of the layer of the cake, which is called RARE, which is rare or retrieval augmented reuse. What that means is our AI companion, which is called co-writer, will search through your approved library of existing components and reuse it directly, right? Which means that it's keeping its original approval, its history, and there is no generation of content that is involved at all in that bottom layer. So what does it mean for a reviewer? The reviewer is just confirming that it is fit for purpose, right? The second level is what we call as transformation or retrieval augmented transformation. And this is where a component needs a little bit of adapting rather than reusing as is. And in this case, what our companion will do, the co-writer will do, it will make controlled and localized changes that preserve the original meaning, but still have a relationship to the original content that it took it from, right? So again, the important piece is that even if you're changing the context, the meaning remains the same, but if you have adapted it to a local instance, you still have traceability to your original source, which has not changed, right? And only in the third instance, and this is the top of the cake, the icing, so to speak, is you only do the third level only when nothing suitable exists to reuse or adaptation is not a possibility. So in this case, AI will draft the new content, but again, drafting of the new content is still based on grounded in the passages from your own library. It never goes out to the internet. It doesn't basically drift because it has this underlying layer of wealth of information that is below in it. The drafting is again very, very constrained, very, very nuanced in that sense. So again, I think the key takeaway that I would have from this particular slide is that to me, it's a very logical way of thinking about from a reviewer's lens, what does it mean? right? If you think about from a reviewer's angle, your effort rises as you move from reuse to transformation to generate, right? So obviously the lowest level of effort is if you're reusing information. And the highest level of effort for a reviewer is when you're generating a content, because you have to review the whole thing again. So by preferring first reuse and then keeping the review footprint as small as possible as you go up the chain, is when those efficiencies kick in beyond just the components that are granular in nature. And this is what really makes governed content and governed AI and not autonomous AI, which we typically see in the market, keeping the traceability intact, keeping the auditability intact, and GxP readiness and compliance intact in one place. So this is, again, if you look at the last slide, where we talked about 25% improvement in the first draft, that's where these numbers come from. All right, so what we just saw is that the review effort climbs as you move, right? But again, I want to make a quick clarification here. What's different from the last slide to this slide is that there we were talking about where the content comes from. Here we are talking about who signs it off, right? So between any AI draft and a final release, there are 3 mandatory human gates. The author accepts the change, the subject matter reviews it, and then the quality assurance signs off. But those gates are built to be in the fastest path through the work. So essentially what that means is the reviewer sees only the changed content in the context of what the change is, right? And the reasoning and the provenance of why it changed is also available to the right audience. And by accepting or revising a single action with no rekeying, the movement of information from a draft to a governed release of even AI-generated content becomes much more faster and easier. All right, so let's talk about 3 scenarios because we talked about the basis of what we are doing, but I also want to kind of take you through what you can do in the context of implementation, depending upon where you are in your journey, right? So let's look at the first step. If you are in a, let's start with where you have really not begun, right? So our advice typically is very simple. Is we typically tell, don't try to boil the ocean, right? Pick one content type, labeling or CMC, and then audit it end to end. So what that means is take a single statement, like Emily said, take a dosing statement for one product and trace it every place it lives. You will find it is, you may find it that it's copied across your US label, your EUPI, your company code data sheet, your patient leaflet, or your submission documents, right? And then compound that by saying, then across markets, across the 27 EU countries, Japan, Canada, et cetera, how does this all lay out? When you lay all that out, what you're doing is you're really drawing a map of your dependency exposure, right? Anywhere you can't reproduce the statement straight from a single source, that's a gap. And this is the map, and this is the picture you typically put in front of a leadership. So you make a business case. And again, this is all vendor independent, and you can start doing it today. If you are, let's say, in the middle of implementation, your challenge is a little bit different, right? Technology is really rarely the real problem in this stage. Typically, the friction shows up in places where old ways of working just got carried over instead of being redesigned. So what our advice would be is obviously go and find these 3 to 5 points where your team still default to recreating content instead of reusing it. Maybe drafting reuses, maybe drafting reuses and components, but regional adaptations, cross affiliate review, etc., are still being done from scratch. And if you can identify maybe 3 to 5 of those pain points, it's telling you something. It's an adoption and a design. It's an adoption design problem and not necessarily a training problem. I would also advise to pay special attention to people who are used to owning documents. In a component world, your role has to evolve from writing for yourself to writing for the organization. And that necessarily needs to be communicated effectively. So say that out loud, and then and then the adoption might get much more quicker. Let's also look at what happens if you are gone live. If you have gone live, I think congratulations. You've just you have a much subtler change and adoption problem to tackle, and that is typically around trust. And what that means is that if your reuse rates are low and it's not the usage number, it's a trust issue. People only reuse content they believe in is current and correct, right? And the way to enable that trust is like we talked about, right? If the FHIR messages are validated, there is a trust element to it. If the components are highly enriched with that FHIR data, then there's an element of trust to it, right? So as you build these trust layers, as you go live and the adoption increases, the trust factor keeps on increasing, and so increasing day by day, right? So again, these are some of the metrics that we typically see. They are anecdotal, but essentially, the major thing to focus on is reuse by default, generate only when it is necessary. All right, so lastly, there are a few more slides I'll talk about, but one of the things I want to talk about is one of the other things you could do is also look at regulators themselves, right? What are they doing? Use regulators themselves as your benchmark, right? Every region is now spelling out in real detail, as Alex and Emily said, the structured data they expect to receive, right? In the US, it's initiatives around quality review and structured manufacturing submissions. In EU, it's the EPI, as we talked about, right? The point is, take your own content model and lay it next to what each of these regulators expect and ask a question, right? Can my architecture really produce what they're asking for? Yes or no? And everywhere your answer is no, you just found a gap, right? That's the whole point, right? So layering in what regulators are asking for is as important as developing your content model. So let's look at some ways. This is the happy path, but oftentimes programs do go wrong, right? And mostly those programs go wrong because of maybe 3 or 4 buckets, that we have described here. And essentially, the fix is pretty much known as well, right? The first failure mode, or the first failure that we typically find is, first going in technology first without the governance platform underneath, right? The fix for is obviously is to stand up your own governance model, before you pick up any tools. And that's not talking about a tool, it's talking about what Emily talked about. How do you think about FHIR in an enterprise way? How do you think about cross-domain exposure to these solutions, right? So they are not just being designed for labeling, but the ERP can use it, the module 3 can use it, and so on and so forth, right? So that's one area that you need to look at. And this again is the second point we're talking about, which is right the poor upstream data quality, right? So that convergence of good quality upstream that can then come into an authoring solution, then can go into a downstream DMS like Viva or a RIMS system is super important. The third is really lack of cross-functional ownership. I think this we talked about, right? I don't think we are in a, I think where we are moving towards is because of the convergence of all these data standards. You really need to have an organizational governance board, for a lack of a better term, right? And this governance board is not just looking at labeling as its own individual solution, but they are basically combining and joining forces together to say how this impacts our organization as a whole. And then lastly, measuring success too early, right? It's easy to assume that you will see benefits in 3 months, right? That's typically not the case. With a change like what we are talking about, it typically takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months for steady state, provided that you've done the governance aspects before. But always lead with your leading indicators. Like let the reuse gains compound over a month or so, but not in days, right? So having some realistic expectations around solution, and the adoption is going to be super important. So lastly, let me just bring everything back home. I want to leave you with 3 principles for kind of, if you're thinking about moving in this direction, having FHIR standards, having a governance platform underneath, there is some sequencing questions you need to ask yourself, right? Essentially, it's all about the order of things that you do is typically based upon how much validation risk you want to carry, right? As we discussed, always govern before you digitize. Stand up your content model, your ownership. Let the technology follow the governance, never the other way around. If you do buy a tool, before you agree how content is owned and approved, you really need to have just you really need to understand how to scale it, right? So proving the scale, proving how to scale, showing that components genuinely propagate from a few priority products before you extend it to the whole group, to the whole portfolio, that's as important as well. And thirdly, as we talked about, measure outcomes, not just the activity, right? And doing it at the right time and sequencing it in a phased manner goes a long way in in putting these systems in place and putting these foundations in place for you to grow and scale at an enterprise grade. All right, so Donna, I will hand this back to you. That was the end of my presentation.
All right. Thanks, Murli. Thanks, Alex and Emily, for a great presentation. Again, kind of talking about not only the current industry impacts, but the practical takeaways on what people can, everybody in the audience can do now, things they can take away, regardless of where they're at in their process. So let's go to the questions. We did have some questions submitted directly. So let me see if let's pull up the first one. Murli, this looks like this is for you. You shared outcomes like 80% component reuse and 25 to 30% reduction in time to first draft. Can you explain, and this is a 2-part question, can you explain what are the organizational and architectural conditions that determine whether a customer actually achieved those numbers? That's the first part. The second part is what separates the implementations that get there from those that stall at lower reuse, say like at 20%?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so the implementations that really hit those metrics have maybe 1 or 2 things in common, right? First, they have invested in the content architecture and design before the platform configuration itself. And this is going back to the slides that I was talking about is, conceptually, if you think about the FHIR architecture, it is an enterprise architecture, right? And it requires some commonalities and some collation of knowledge before it can get really implemented. And that's where our colleagues from NNIT can really help, because they've done that as in practice, right? And once you've established that enterprise practice, the component model, which constitutes the reusable component, how components are classified, what metadata they carry, how the variation relationship is defined, etc., becomes like more of a configuration design problem, right? In the sense that if I have highly structured FHIR objects coming from upstream, then attaching that to a component becomes much easier, right? So that design piece is super important in that first phase of your engagement, to build a component library that is highly valued, highly structured, highly enriched with FHIR objects, makes your downstream use much easier. And the second piece of it is, again, as I was telling, don't try to measure your successes early, right? A company that treats maybe this as a 1 to 6 month engagement and tries to measure value quickly is kind of bound to not necessarily get the full picture. You need to have a stability in the solution, stability in your adoption, and then basically understand how the content model really has been validated, right? So again, programs that set 80% reuse at a 6-month KPI are probably measuring too early, and I would really caution against that. And you will probably draw incorrect conclusions about platform performance if you're trying to measure that reuse capability very early on in your organization.
All right, awesome. We did have one, we have several other questions. Let's go to one that's kind of related to that, but it also ties, I think it kind of marries in what Emily was talking about, but probably still lands in your area, Merle, which is, can you recap in headline the difference in functions between FHIR and Docuvera? So can you explain the difference between the two of them?
Yeah, so again, Alex and Emily, please chime in as you require. But essentially, think about FHIR as your standard. It's a transport layer, right? It's basically a way for you to encode, to Emily's point, how is dosage information defined in one particular domain versus the other domain. So when that information flows between an ERP and the label, say for example, then they have talking common language. Now, FHIR talks about the structure. The narrative pieces also are included in that structure, right? So, when you're thinking about authoring a label, say for example, let's assume the clinical particulars section, right, or any other safety section, you want to write the narrative pieces alongside the FHIR objects that are aligned to it, like what is the SNOMED code, what is the MEDRA code, or any other codec that is attached to certain terminologies that is being used in the narratives, right? Because you don't want the subject matter expert to be encoding those while they are authoring. It's a back-end process, right? So where the FHIR object and the FHIR configuration sits nicely with Docuvera is that Docuvera gives you the presentation layer, and the FHIR object or the terminology behind it is all hidden back in the back end, and it gets attached at the export side. It just gets attached when it's required to be translated and it needs to be transported to health authority.
All right. Let's see. Well, you're on a roll, Merle. This next one also looks like it's for you. Human acceptance gates for AI appear prominently throughout your talk. But organizations face, I guess, what the person who posed the question say, a practical tension, which is gates that are too heavy to get bypassed, or gates that are too light to create gates that are too light create quality risk. So you have obviously kind of this almost no-win situation. How does Docuvera calibrate human acceptance gates so they are both compliant and actually embedded in how people work?
Yeah, I think we touched upon this a little bit. It's all about design principles where the gates are proportional to the risk of the risk profile of the specific instance, right? So as we talked about, if your AI is integrated into the workflow rather than being placed alongside, it becomes a rather a bigger risk, right? So the way we think about it at Docuvera is that the AI solution that we have is attached and is playing alongside a governed space where it's not necessarily pulling information from multiple sources, and it's only giving you information that makes sense, right? And that's the 3-level hierarchy that we talked about. So for drafting, acceleration, and reuse detection, they are two different type of risks in a sense, right? So if you talk about draft acceleration, you're really talking about human gate being the editorial view, right? And where the reviewing of the AI generated output against the source is really necessarily a task for reviewing the first draft per se. So net, what makes gates actually used is if a gate is in the inflow, in the workflow comparison stage, a single action of accepting the change, might not be necessary. So essentially, what we want to do is use that intelligence in a proper manner so that the humans are brought in at a stage where the impact is the most, right? So again, as we talked about, we don't want to be people reviewing everything all at once, but only use reviews very, very strategically. So those human gates are very deliberate in Docuvera, that we wanted them to focus on areas where it matters the most and not necessarily apply the same rubric to every instance of review that happens.
All right, we have time for one more question. Alex, this looks like this is in your direction. You covered EPI, IDMP, and SPOR, ICH, M11, PQ-CMC as converging regulatory drivers, but they hit different teams at different timelines. For organizations trying to sequence their investments, how do you advise prioritizing across these programs without building a separate infrastructure for each one?
Thank you for the question. So I would recommend that the prioritization should be based on both urgency and business impact. For example, for companies with vaccines or oncology portfolios, EMA, EPI requirements in Q3, Q4 2026 are the most immediate priority. For broader IDMP SPOR programs, PMS readiness should be addressed in parallel. ICH M11 mainly affects clinical teams, while PQ-CMC is mostly relevant for CMC and manufacturing. And all of these initiatives depend on structured, traceable, and reusable content. So treating each mandate as a separate system creates the very data silos that we were highlighting during our presentation that structured content standards are meant to eliminate.
All right, great. We actually are at time now, so we're going to go ahead and close out the webinar. For anybody who posed questions in the question box or submitted them directly, we will actually get those responses back to you in written form over the next few days, along with a recorded copy of this webinar that you can watch on demand at your convenience. But thank you, everybody. On behalf, again, of Docuvera and NNIT, on behalf of Merle, Emily, and Alex, thank you again for attending. We've enjoyed having you and look to see you on a future webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.